Hi, everyone, and welcome to another creative writing seminar. We're going to be talking about a fun subject today, world building. World building is a fun and interesting part of creative writing. The further we get from the real world in a story, the more we have to make up the world of what we're writing about. And it can be one of the most exciting and inventive parts of writing a story or a book is figuring out what the world of your book is going to be like. So we're going to get into that in just a second. Let's see who we have here today. Looks like we have a big class. Hi, everybody. AG is here. Anya, Alette, Amelia, Austin, Aziz, Brando, Kanan, Cletus, Cora, Cosimo, Evelyn, Fallon, Gabriel, Haley, Isha, Isis, Logan, Mackenzie, Mimi, Olivia, and Ron Beer. This is awesome. I see a lot of returning names, but I also see some new ones too. So welcome. If this is your first creative writing webinar, I'm happy to see you here. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. Or if you need to share anything with me or let me know anything, that's a good place to put it too. So hi to everybody that's saying hi in the Q&A box. Good to see you guys back. My day is going great. Thank you, Isha. Thank you for asking. And hi to everybody else. Yeah, glad you guys are all here. Yes, our green screen today, we have a nice magical fantasy world behind us. I thought that would be fun because we're going to be talking about creating magical worlds. So we might as well have a magical world to look upon. All right, let's get into it. So, world building. What do we mean by world building? Well, world building is creating the environment your story will take place in. Your story can take place in a location as small as a village or a town or even a single school or home, or it can take place in a location as big as an entire galaxy. You will be the one deciding what the world of your story is like. So if you're writing something like Star Wars, the world you have to create for your story might be multiple planets and huge amounts of space with different civilizations. If you're writing a story about somebody who their new classmate at school is an alien and the whole story takes place just within their own town, the world of your story is just that town and that school and that neighborhood. Both having a neighborhood or having a whole galaxy that your story takes place in, there are important things to decide when writing your story. We always want to make our story feel real to the reader. We want them to feel like it's a real place, that they can imagine what things look like. They can imagine what things sound like, what the food tastes like, hopefully. And it's our job as writers to really make all of that be very easy for the reader to experience. So the different levels of this. There are basically 3 different types of worlds that you can build in a story. The first one of these is almost the same as our world. It's pretty much exactly like the world that we live in here. One example is Diary of a Wimpy Kid. These stories all take place in what's basically the real world. There's nothing very different about the world that Diary of a Wimpy Kid takes place in to our world. Also, the genre of historical fiction is also, I have one book here, it's called The Secret School. This author, Avi, he writes lots of historical fiction books. Pretty much everything that he writes takes place in the real world that we live in. But the books are fiction books. They didn't usually happen in real life, but they are using this shared world that we all live in to be the world of the story. So if you choose to write a story that takes place in this world, pretty much, it will still be a little bit different because the story that you write, if it's fiction, you'll be creating new characters, you'll be creating new things that didn't happen in real life. So it'll be a little bit different from the real world. But what can be really nice about that is that your reader lives in this real world. They already know a lot of things about this world. So there's a lot of things that you can assume your reader already knows about. If you set your story in this shared world and you say that he went down the street to a fast food place to get a burger, you can kind of leave it at that. The person will know what a burger tastes like, probably. They'll know what like a McDonald's or a Burger King looks like. They can kind of experience what's happening in the story without a lot of extra explanation, because you are setting the events of your story in a world that we already know pretty well. Yeah, a lot of books that you read take place in pretty much their own version of this world. And it's easy to do the same thing yourself. So there might be some things, though, in your story or your book that you do still have to create. You might set a story in this shared world that we all live in, but make up a fictional town. You might decide that your story takes place in Colorado, but you make up your own town in Colorado for the story to take place. Within that town, everything is still pretty much the same as the real world. You might make up your own restaurants, your own street names. But, you know, other than that, you can expect your reader to kind of know everything. The next category of world would be our world, but with some pretty big differences. One example of this is the Harry Potter series. The Harry Potter series takes place on the planet Earth. It takes place in this shared world that we all live in, but with a big difference. J.K. Rowling has the idea in her books that there is this whole secret world of wizards going on at the same time. So the idea is that it's this world that we all live in, and everything's pretty much the same, except living hidden among us are witches and wizards. They have their own secret schools. They kind of have their own secret jobs and things going on. But for a lot of things, we still understand, you know, what's happening. When Harry goes to school, he goes to a train station, and trains still work the same way that they work in, you know, in the real world. Harry in the real world still has to like spend money if he wants to buy some food, or, you know, he lives in a house that looks just like every other house that we've ever seen, at least in England. So there's a lot of things that you can still expect the reader to know about, but at the same time, you're inventing some new things. There's like there are some big differences, and that's what the author will have to create. J.K. Rowling created the whole wizarding world part of this shared world that we live in. And at a number of places in her books, you get to see how those worlds collide. Harry has to leave the normal world to go to, go to school every time he leaves for school. And by the way, when we use this word world, we don't mean that it's like a separate planet or something. We just mean it's the environment that the character is in. He's leaving the normal everyday environment, his street that he lives in with his family in England, and he kind of leaves that environment and he goes to Hogwarts. He goes off and he experiences things with other wizards that his aunt and uncle and their, rest of his family, they would never know anything about. They would never experience it. So the third type of world that we're going to talk about is a completely different world or a completely different environment. These are stories or books that take place not in our world, or maybe they take place on a different planet, or they take place on a version of Earth that is so different from our version that it might as well be a different planet. One example that came to mind is the Wings of Fire series. These books, they have all these dragons. They live on a continent that is not any continent that we recognize. They have their own adventures and a whole different setting and world than we're used to. So it's a completely different world. When you write a story or a book that takes place in its own different world, you have the most work to do as a writer or as a creator, because the environment and the world that your characters live in is going to be so different from anything that the reader has experienced, you're going to have to explain a lot or show a lot of this world and how it works. You're going to have to try to explain the world that the characters live in such a way that the reader doesn't get annoyed, because they don't want you just being kind of a history book or a textbook all the time. Your reader won't want you to stop and be like, okay, so by the way, this is how food works in this world. Oh, and by the way, this is how transportation works. As a writer, it'll be your job to create that world in a natural way and give all that information without annoying or boring your reader. Now, it is also important to understand that there are two basic ways you can write a story or write a book. And the first of these is you have an idea and you just go for it. You just write it. You don't do a lot of planning beforehand, and you just have fun and you kind of create the world of your story as you go along. When you start writing a story or start writing a book, you might not know what the world of your story is going to be like. You might start the story off thinking, yeah, my story will take place in this world that we all live in. But then a few chapters in, you realize, oh, I want my character to go to an alternate dimension, or to the underworld, or to space, or somewhere else. And that's totally fine. A lot of writers, a lot of very successful writers, just make up their story as they go along. Because remember, in creative writing, there's a lot of suggestions, but there's no rules. It's totally okay as a writer to just make it up as you go along if that's what works for you. A lot of writers do that really successfully. So when we talk about world building, you have to understand that some writers just kind of, they just put down what they want on the page as they go. Maybe by the time they finish the story or finish the book, they might go back and kind of clean it up and make sure it all makes sense. But that's one totally okay way to do it. The other main way to write a story or to write a book is to actually do a lot of planning beforehand. There are a lot of writers who they kind of create the whole world of their story before they ever get started. And that is where the term world building is usually used. It means that you as a writer or as a creator are actually sitting down, and it's like you're inventing the world as if you are a mad scientist and you get to just make it all from scratch. And that's one of the fun things about writing, is getting to make up the whole world. So that's what I wanted to go through, some of the steps of, so you want to create a world for your story? What do you have to do? Let's talk about it. So here are some of the key steps. What needs to be built in your world? Well, a good place to start is, what is the geography of the world? Before there were any characters or people, if you think about a world from like the dawn of time up to whatever time it is in your story, a planet would usually come into existence. Like if you've been watching any of the space guys, any of their webinars, you might know that the stars and the planets and everything form long before there were ever any people on the planet. So what a lot of writers do is they actually figure out, well, what does this planet or what does this world look like? What is the geography of this world? One example of this is J.R.R. Tolkien, the creator of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He did a ton of work of thinking through, what is the geography of my world? Here's just one drawing or one map of Tolkien's world, Middle Earth, just one part of that world. But he figured out, where should the mountain ranges be? Where should the rivers be? Where would the forests be? The way the world is in terms of like where mountains are, where the physical features of the world, it actually does a lot to shape what happens in that world. If we look at all these mountains and rivers and forests, etc., you might start thinking to yourself, well, where would people live in a world like this? How would there being these giant mountain ranges affect people living in this area? Well, the people that live over on one side of the mountain range, if it's a giant mountain range, they might not have a lot of contact with people on the other side of the mountain range. Knowing the geography of your world, you can start to think about what's going to happen in the history of that world. What would happen? How would the people in that world act based on just the land features, the water features, the weather? So if you look for this in a lot of stories, you'll find that the way the physical world is around the characters will impact a lot of things that happen. So for an exercise today, for the first exercise that I want you guys to do, you could just create this for yourself. If you wanted to share something in the Q&A box, go ahead. But right now, just for fun, we're going to just make up some geography. This could be, you could think to yourself, I want to write a story that takes place on a super, super small planet with really low gravity. And you can already start thinking about how would that affect the people that would live on a planet like that? If there was really, really, really low gravity because the planet's really small, can everybody on that planet jump really high? Maybe you want to make a story that takes place on a world that's really close to its star. So maybe it's really, really hot all over the world all the time. So go ahead and in the Q&A box, if you'd like, you can also just create something for yourself and keep it to yourself. But if you'd like to share, come up with some geography. What could be something really interesting about the geography of your world, of your planet, that could then affect the events of the story that you're writing? I'm going to go ahead and look in the Q&A box while you guys do that and while you think about that, just to see if there's any questions in here or any comments. Alette says, I love creative writing. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Isha says, the green screen looks magical. Yeah, I like it too. That's why I picked this one. Alette asks, do we need a pencil and paper? Yeah, if you'd like to, you can write down your examples for yourself, or you can type them in the Q&A box if you'd like. Either one's totally okay. Austin asks, have I read The Heroes of Olympus? I have not read that series yet. I've read, I think, 4 out of 5 of the original Percy Jackson books. I don't know why I never got around to reading the 5th one. I need to finish the original Percy Jackson books. Milo says, I like the I Survived books. Yeah, those ones are really fun. All right. Okay, let's see if there's some answers starting to come in. Alette says, a pretty planet that always has pink mist and tall mountains on it. Oh, that's really fun. I'm already thinking about how would it affect people if there was pink mist all the time, all around us? I wonder if people would always get really close before they said anything to each other, because if there was always mist everywhere, it might be really hard to see people. If there's really tall mountains, yeah, that could affect the world in a lot of ways. Austin is creating a story where the planet is all water over the entire surface of the planet. Wow. Yeah, that would really affect things. If the whole planet has water all over it, do everybody live in boats? Do they have whole towns or villages that are like a whole bunch of like wooden platforms all connected together? Do whole villages kind of like float across the surface of the planet? I'd want to read to find out. Milo says in his story, every 20 feet, there's a volcano. I hope the people that live in that world are all fireproof so that they don't die from all the lava everywhere. Isis asks, which Percy Jackson book was your favorite? I like the one where they're in the maze, and I believe they have to create the wings. And I think, yeah, they're trying to escape from the Minotaur. It's been years since I've read those books, but that one was a lot of fun. All right, Kanan says, Volcania. It's a remote planet with lots of volcanoes, and there are a few people left on the planet. The volcanoes form super quickly, and when they erupt, the people must get to safety fast. I love that idea, Kanan. I think it's a great idea because it really starts making me think about, yeah, if volcanoes could form really quickly and you always were trying to escape from them, I think that that planet probably wouldn't have any big cities. How could you have a big city when volcanoes are constantly erupting? Like you're saying, people have to escape from them quickly. Yeah, people would probably be like, nomads. Do you know that word, where people move quickly from place to place and they don't really stay in one spot? The geography of that world would really affect how people had to live there. Isha says, I want my story to take place in a store where there is a stall where you can go into space. Well, that's interesting. If you could quickly go into space whenever you wanted, that would probably affect a lot of things about how people live in that world. If everybody could just go up into space, maybe you can go up into space and come down quickly in another part of the world. Maybe we don't really own cars. Maybe we don't really use airplanes because it's so easy to travel around. That would be interesting. Haley says, a world made out of marshmallows. So I'm thinking, one, I would jump up and down all the time. It would constantly be like living on a trampoline. And whenever I was hungry, I would just reach down and rip up some marshmallow and eat it. So don't really need farms. Don't really need grocery stores, do we? We're just going to eat marshmallows all the time. Mackenzie says that in their story, the world is covered in mountains and is infested with dragons. That's a great idea. If there's mountains and dragons everywhere, that's definitely going to affect how we live. Let's see. Evelyn talks about, in their story, there is a large kingdom called Gremlinwood. It had a deep, dark forest and a large castle in the center of a large village. This is part of a real book that they're writing. That's awesome. AG says, a huge gold planet near a superstar where there are rivers of gold. There are also gold mountains and volcanoes. Wow. If there's rivers of gold, if gold just like flows down the rivers to the ocean, I'm going to assume that people on that planet probably don't use gold as money. Because if it's super common and it's everywhere, you wouldn't use gold as money. So I wonder what they do use for money on that planet. Ethan says, a world is our planet in the future. The world has been developed to a world where the gravity is only 1/10 of our planet's current gravity. We went from an age of magic to technology back to magic, soon settling on advanced technology where plasma guns exist and dangerous space monsters have invaded. Well, that's awesome. All right. Let's remember that example when we get to a little bit later on, when we start talking about what do we do after geography. You guys are putting a ton of great examples in here, but if I read every single one of these, I think we'd run out of time. So you guys are doing a great job. Keep on putting your awesome answers in there. But we're going to go on to the next part. All right, so after we think about the geography of our world, the next question is the people. The next thing that needs to be built in your world is the people that live there. So after you know what this world looks like, where are there mountains and rivers, and what's the temperature and what's the weather like, you could ask yourself, what kind of people or creatures would live in a world like that? As we already started talking about a little bit, if your planet is hot all the time and there's always volcanoes erupting, maybe the people that live in that world would have to be super fast. They might all be really great runners. Here's a picture from the first of the Narnia books. The witch in this book has made an eternal winter is going on. So you can see that this eternal winter is like the weather that's currently happening there. How does that affect how the people are acting? Well, they're using a sleigh as their transportation. They have like some reindeer pulling it along. There's a lot of other ways that the current sort of geography and the weather are affecting how people live. In a lot of other stories, the people of the world, they have adapted to living in that world. You might ask yourself, for example, like in J.R.R. Tolkien's books, the giant mountains are usually where the dwarves live. The forests are usually where elves live. His books kind of started a lot of the ideas that we have about sort of the normal fantasy creatures. And he would have like the dark, evil mountains where the bad guys live. That's where all like the orcs come from. So in your world, in your fantasy setting, after you've thought about geography, you can start thinking about what kind of people live in a world like that. How does that physical world affect the creatures that live there? So take what you already wrote for the geography, or think up some new geography if you want to, and really think about what creatures or what people live in my world. How does the geography of the world create the situation that these people find themselves in? If the planet is very stable and the weather is really nice all the time, your world might have people living in big cities and they're all healthy and they're doing great because the environment is so safe. There's lots of great farmland, so they always have plenty of food and everything is really nice for them. If your planet, if it's really super easy to jump to other planets and back through space, then maybe a lot of other alien races live on the planet because people have been traveling from planet to planet for a long time and they've kind of got their differences worked out. If your world is covered with marshmallow, or the whole world is an ocean, or the whole world is covered with gold, well, what are those people like? What kind of people or creatures can live in a world like that? Go ahead and describe those people or creatures in the Q&A box. All right, so Isis says, this is the future where we have to live on the moon because we polluted so much. And every once in a while, we have to go down to Earth to get supplies that were left there for when we needed more, and when we need to build more things that are needed for us to survive on the moon. That's a great example. Basically the geography or the situation on Earth is, if it's so polluted that you can't live there anymore, well, having to leave the planet and go live on the moon, that's a really logical effect, cause and effect. Planet's too polluted, people have to go live somewhere else. Readers really like it when your story kind of makes sense, like the things that are happening in the story are happening for a reason. In the geography or the natural environment of the Earth, making people live somewhere else, that makes sense to me. All right. Joseph says, what about a world where there's so much gravity that you can't walk? Well, that's interesting. If the planet was giant and it had a huge amount of gravity, but people still lived there, well, how would that affect the people? If gravity was always pulling them down and you couldn't stand up because it was pulling you to the ground so much, maybe the people have little carts and they just drag themselves along all the time. Maybe the creatures that develop on that planet are kind of like squishy jellyfish people. Maybe you can't have a bone structure and maybe you can't walk on 2 feet on a planet like that. That's a good point you're making there. Let's see. Kanan says, in Volcania, the people there all speak in a different language, and someone from Earth found a portal thing and got teleported to Volcania and must get around and learn their language until he can get back. All right, awesome. Thinking about how the geography might affect the people. Yeah, if there was volcanoes everywhere all the time and the people constantly were running for their lives, I could see how maybe different communities of people would get separated and would develop their own languages. Maybe even within one country like the United States, if we got really separated from each other for hundreds of years and then you checked in on us, we would probably be speaking pretty differently by that point. All right, so Evelyn says that the people that live in Gremlinwood are really hard workers, and they have to know some magic to drive away the gremlins. That's a good point. Yeah, if you live in an area that has a lot of wild, dangerous creatures or animals, you would develop over time to probably have to fight back to keep safe. So that would make logical sense that if you had a lot of gremlins that were going to be dangerous, you develop some kind of technology, or in this case, magic, to keep themselves safe. That's a great point. Let's see. Milo, see, we have two people here talking about volcanoes. This is great. Milo says they live in the volcanoes. They control the blasts, and they can swim in the lava and use the lava pools as forges. A forge, of course, is a place that you heat up metal and you make metal things like swords or other weapons or whatever. So that's awesome. Yeah, I'm picturing right now, if these people have always lived on this lava planet with all these volcanoes, yeah, they would probably be like fireproof. But swimming around the lava, that's awesome. That makes a really fun image for me to think about that I never thought about before. Living in the lava sounds great. Let's see. AG says, 20-foot-long super crocs are the only animals on the planet because they have thick, heat-proof skin and they have an extra eyelid for living in the thick gold swamps. Most of them wear contact lenses to see through the gold. That's awesome. Very, very cool. Joseph goes on to say, the people that live there are turtles because everything is so slow due to high gravity. That's great. All right. Fallon says, in the floating islands, there live the air dragons, the birds, and different flying creatures. On the surface of the island, there live trees and other mythical creatures. There might be unicorns or ents or whatnot. Ents are like tree people. You might even run into a werewolf or a kitsune. Well, I don't actually know what that is. You'll have to tell me what a kitsune is. Under the island in the fiery depths, you might find phoenixes or dragons. In the water surrounding it, you might find hippocampus or giant frogs. There are so many different mythical creatures that you could find on our island. So that's awesome. Yeah, so you're imagining magical floating islands and thinking about what kind of creatures would live in different areas based on that. That's awesome. Isis asks, what do you do if you want to write fan fiction? Fan fiction, of course, is where you're taking another creator's already established world and you're writing your own things that take place in that world. Well, the thing about fan fiction is usually the world is already created for you. So if you don't want to have to build any more world, you don't have to. If you want to write a story that takes place in the Harry Potter world, well, we already know a lot about the rules of how magic work there. We know what a lot of the locations are. You can kind of just play in that world and write in that world and you're good to go. If you want to build more for that world, let's say you want to make a whole colony of wizards that live on the moon and have them interact with Hogwarts. Well, that's what you can do in fan fiction. You can write whatever you want. So you're free to use what's already there or build more of a world for yourself. All right, let's go on to the third and last part of world building that we're going to talk about today. So what needs to be built in your world? You should think about the geography of the world, and then you should think about the people that live there. And lastly, how the people live. This is the biggest part because really this is where it spirals out into everything else that you could think about. You could ask questions like, what kind of jobs do people have? What do they eat? What are the vehicles like? What is the history of this world? So after you've already thought about what does the world actually look like and what kind of people or creatures are there, that's where you have the most work to do to think about if they live on a lava world, well, what kind of food grows on a lava world? What are these people eating? If you live on a super high gravity world where that crushes everybody to the ground, well, how do people get around? What's their transportation like? What kind of jobs can you do on a super high gravity world? It kind of makes more sense to, start with what's the world like and then figure these things out. If you start saying what people's jobs are and what they eat and then later decide it's a super high gravity world, you might have done things a little bit backwards. If you act like farms and things are normal on your world and then say it has super crushing high gravity, your reader might go, wait, hold on. How are all these things growing normally if like the gravity crushes everything to the ground? That's a good question. So usually it makes sense to make the world first and then the people or creatures that live in it, and then figure out how do those people live in that world. I thought I'd throw up here just a few more examples of different worlds that have, you know, a lot of details worked out for them. Aragon was a pretty popular series of fantasy books written for young people. That writer, you know, came up with a lot of things with dragons and people that ride on dragons. The Hunger Games, it's probably a little bit old for you guys now, but it was mostly meant for young readers. It came out maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago now. But that world, while it's kind of like Earth, it's also very, very different. And that writer, Suzanne Collins, she figured out a lot of details of how do people live in the world in this sort of, you know, this is the world where they make young people fight to see, you know, they make them fight to the death in these things called the Hunger Games. The Maze Runner has a very weird world at the beginning where all these young men find themselves, you know, trapped in a maze. But the description of that maze and the world inside it is very well described. A lot of these, you know, questions have been answered. So for yourselves, now on the, you've already figured out the geography. You've talked a little bit about the people that live there. Think about some of these questions now. What kind of jobs do people have? What do they eat? What is transportation like? What are the houses like? What are the buildings like? What do people do for fun? Do they have sports in this world? Like in the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling did a great job answering a lot of these questions. The kinds of foods that they eat, the games that they play for fun, what kind of holidays they have, how they go to school, what sort of jobs they have. She filled in a lot of these details and made it really fun for her readers at the same time. So go ahead and try to answer some of these questions for yourselves. Thank you, Fallon and Milo. They say that a kitsune is a magical fox. Oh, so you learn something new every day. Thanks, guys. All right. So Cletus says, what about a universe where all the stars are dying and the last humans live in a giant like spaceship ring around a white dwarf star? That sounds awesome. Yeah, you've already figured out kind of the physical space where they live and what's happening based on that. If you lived in a world where all the stars are dying, that might have a pretty big effect on the way you live, what kind of jobs you do. Are they trying to collect energy? Are they, you know, what do you do for fun in a dying universe? It makes you ask some big questions about that story. One person's asking, I think this is based on the fan fiction question. They say, don't you have to ask the author first? With fan fiction, if you're just writing something for fun for yourself, you don't have to ask the author. You can just write your own stories. It's totally okay. Where you need permission from the author is if you plan to try to sell what you wrote. If I wrote my own Harry Potter book and I tried to sell it in a bookstore, yeah, I could get in trouble because I'm taking sort of the ideas and the story of another author and I'm trying to like make money off of it for me. But writers who just write stories for fun and they just share them freely on the internet, that's fine. That's actually totally legal. And you don't have to ask permission to write fan fiction either. Let's see. All right, Kanan says, they dug tunnels all over the world right before a giant volcano made the planet very remote. The person that got teleported there has to figure out the tunnels and help the few people that remain until he realizes that Volcania is somehow controlling Earth and that Volcania's connection is getting stronger and volcanoes on Earth are erupting and they have to save Earth. That's awesome. Your idea here, I can tell you're already like really thinking through this and it's great. Yeah, that's the geography and how the people live there, you know, or the people affecting how you'd have to live in a world like that. When all the volcanoes start erupting, that they dig into the planet and they live underground. Yeah, I can see that. That seems like a logical way to try to escape from flying lava all the time. Austin says, and I think this is from, yeah, this is probably from the idea of like a world covered in water. They eat raw fish. They live on rafts that are connected together. They swim in the poisonous ocean, and they use boats as transportation. That all makes sense to me. I assume that because they're eating raw fish and they're swimming in the poisonous ocean, these people have sort of developed bodies that can withstand poison, that they have developed themselves to where this is not a problem. That's great. Yeah, one person is asking about the time that we end off. We're ending this seminar at 3:15. So yeah, the creative writing in the afternoon, we usually go from 2:30 to 3:15. So we have a few more minutes. Mackenzie says, my people are all farmers and they are very hard workers. That's great. Evelyn says, the Gremlin wood folk are farmers, sowers, magicians, royalty, knights, and shopkeepers. They give offerings to the Gremlins once a week, but sometimes there is not enough for all of them. That's great. I love how based on how the people, where they live and how they live, that affects, what they're doing. The fact that they live in a giant forest surrounded by, creatures and monsters, that they kind of try to survive by giving offerings. That's a logical way of going about it. Let's see. Ethan has a giant comment here. I don't know if I'll be able to read all this, but it says, a Sverlak is a dangerous space monster at the bottom of Monster Society, covered in tentacles and a big mouth at the middle. With no legs, it must use its tentacles to move. And there are a ton more monster descriptions here. This is great. So yeah, I'm guessing this is based off of some of the earlier geography that you talked about and the creatures that live there. Was yours the super high gravity planet? Because it sounds like a lot of these are like, it talks about monsters that are big blobs and whatnot. So that would make sense on a high gravity planet. Let's see. Oh, Joseph says, Joseph might have had the high gravity world. People are basically snakes in a super high gravity world, and everything is growing because the floor is nutritional. People work on the floor in the high gravity world. Everything is flat. That's pretty funny. Awesome. Good. So I think we're almost out of time. Oh, there's a few more comments here. Logan says, the world is an ocean. People live in airships, and there are giant sea monsters that are super fast. Wow. I want to read that story right away. I love the idea of ocean monsters all over the ocean. So people live up in airships and balloons up above it. That's a great idea. Very cool. Yeah, you guys are starting to pour in more comments here. And I will read all of these, but I think we are now out of time. So thank you guys for talking about world building with me. Remember, you can write a story just coming up with the story as you go along if you want to, and that's totally okay. But if you want to first kind of plan out the world of your story, that can be a lot of fun too. Just think about, what does this world physically look like? What are the geographic features of the world? What kind of people would live in a world like that based on the geography and the weather, where it is in the solar system, etc. And then try to think about, once you've figured out what kind of people live there, how would those people have to live? What kind of technology would they have? What kind of clothes and buildings and food and magic and everything else? And then you can just kind of let your imagination go, and you can make a whole world for your own story. So have fun with that. As always, the best way to get better at writing is just to keep on writing. So keep on writing tomorrow and on the weekend. Have a lot of fun. And I will see all of you hopefully back next week when we're going to have more creative writing webinars. So thank you guys for being here today, and see you next week.